A female journalist is assaulted by anti-conservative protesters, and the mainstream media completely ignore it. Alberta Conservatives carve out a new path for confederation. The woke left ruins Hockey Night in Canada, and a community comes together to support the family of a child with cancer in Ottawa. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, we're coming to you from Calgary, Alberta this week for a special podcast. We were here over the weekend to cover the Alberta Conservative Party's AGM. We have an interview, sat down with Premier Kenney to talk about his plan for the province of Alberta and for Canada. You can catch that over at tnc.news. Now, while we were at this convention, at this conference, we bumped into our friend Sheila Gunn. Sheila is a conservative journalist over at The Rebel. She was outside where there was a protest. Union members had been bussed in to protest against Jason Kenney and some of his austerity measures that he's bringing in Alberta. And this was the confrontation that was caught on tape.
Hey!
So it's pretty clear that the male protester here strikes Sheila Gunn. He hits her in the back. It's caught right there on camera. And yet the mainstream media have completely ignored that this incident happened. If you look at the news stories that came out of the convention over the weekend, even the news stories about the protest, they didn't even so much as mention the fact that a journalist was hit by one of the protesters. It was not a peaceful protest. It was a violent protest. And that is a huge distinction. You know, in Canada, we have the right to peaceful assembly, we have the right to freedom of speech, you have the right to protest politicians as much as you want, but you have to do it peacefully. And once you start assaulting journalists and hitting people, it's no longer a peaceful protest. So for all the journalists that were there covering the protest and to just ignore the incident, you had all the mainstream media there. They were filming the protesters. Why didn't they catch this? The police were there. Why didn't the police go and look into this and investigate it? It's really alarming. And to explain why people are so upset about this, just imagine for a second that there was a group of conservative protesters outside of an NDP convention, and a CBC journalist went out to interview them and talk to them, maybe even push back and challenge them a little bit on what they were doing. Imagine the outrage if one of those conservative protesters had struck and hit a female journalist. It would be the biggest story in the country. It would be the subject of a huge campaign. There would be outrage. There'd be outcries. Politicians would be tweeting about it. It would be the biggest news story in Canada. But for some reason, when it happens to Sheila Gunn at The Rebel, nobody pays attention. And that's a big problem in Canada. We covered it at tnc.news. I interviewed Sheila, but that's not enough. Shame on the mainstream media for ignoring it. And let me just say, I was at the convention. I didn't see the protest. I wasn't there when it was happening. The stories about it made it seem like it was this huge all-day thing that distracted away from the AGM itself. It wasn't. It was barely noticed by the people who were at the convention. I didn't see them. I was there all day. I didn't see them. They came quickly and left. It was cold outside, whatever. But the fact that the mainstream media is more focused on a couple of protesters who were, let's be honest, paid to be there, as opposed to the hundreds, probably 1,000 members of the AGM that were participating in democracy, that were putting forth ideas, that were debating the future of the province of Alberta and the country. It just shows where the media is minded. They don't really care about the progress being made within the governing party. They just care about the few angry people outside, because that's the narrative. I was very pleased to sit down with Premier Jason Kenney. He talked about his fair deal plan. I think that the vision for Canada and what it should be is a very decentralized country. We have regions that are really distinct. What's good for people in Quebec is not necessarily the same as what's good for people in BC, Alberta, or other provinces. So why not have the provinces have more and more control? And that's sort of what the fair deal does. It basically says, to Ottawa, if we don't have these certain conditions met, with pipelines being built, with allowing our resources to get to market without a fair deal on equalization, these are the number of things that we want to do. We're going to start collecting our own taxes, so no longer use the CRA and collect taxes locally in Alberta. We'll have our own police force, our own pension plan, and I think that's huge. And one of the things I would like to see, if Alberta does bring in its own pension plan, is to actually get rid of the scheme of a Ponzi scheme, like the Canada Pension Plan, where everyone just pays in and you don't really know exactly how much you're ever going to get out. You don't have good returns. It's not a really meaningful investment program. That's why people my age and younger can basically never expect to get anything out of the CPP. It's basically just a big waste of money for us, a slush fund going to older generations. So if Alberta does take that over, hopefully, it will focus more on making it fair for young people and for everyone who is paying into it. And I think that this plan, if it's actualized, will strengthen Canada. Instead of Alberta going it alone, let's just give them a lot more power to manage their own business and put Albertans first. So a lot of momentum, pretty exciting stuff. The media is obsessed with the fact that the left and the unions are accusing the premier in Alberta of making cutting nursing and teachers and that kind of thing. I think that's pretty misrepresentative of what's happening. From my understanding, the premier is not cutting those programs. He's just capping them so they're not growing. And the jobs that are being shed it's going to happen through attrition, like someone's retiring and so the position's not going to be replaced, as opposed to actually firing people, which is what the left would have you believe. So lots of misinformation I'm finding while being here in Alberta, that the left is really, instead of putting out the facts as they are, they're sort of distorting them and spinning it, and the media is all too happy to go along with that. All right, moving on. Hockey Night in Canada happened over the weekend. We know that Don Cherry is no longer a part of this program, and so they have a new kind of reimagined left-wing Hockey Night in Canada. Okay, so Ron MacLean's the new host. He has some new co-hosts here, and you can see that they're trying really hard to be diverse and representative of different communities. But hearing Ron MacLean kind of like talk about exactly the kinds of things that the woke left wants you to say, like acknowledging that he believes that he has white privilege, that he was sort of so blind to his own white privilege, that he wasn't doing a good enough job in including people from different races and different ethnicities in his programming. And he says that is an example of systemic racism.
I don't see you as black. I don't see Tara as a woman. And then I realized there's your white male privilege. You know what, Ron? You don't have to see that because you don't need to see that. And you told me, Kwame, an amazing story about when the kids throw back to Hockey Night in Canada. As a general rule, they're often all white. And if they're not all white, the whites often have the speaking part. And it's the same with our Rogers Hometown Hockey. We're so proud of being inclusive, but how many times do we get people of color to pick the 3 stars? And it was just a real eye-opener that I don't recognize the structural racism or sexism.
It's just so cringeworthy to watch a sport like hockey. You watch hockey to relax, to disengage from all of the crazy politics of the world, and to be sitting there, trying to enjoy a hockey game, and to all of a sudden be lectured about identity politics and supposedly not being inclusive enough. Why? Because of the skin color of the kids that they're interviewing, or the kids that get to read out the 3 stars at the end of the hockey game. They're so obsessed with race. It's to the point where it is racist itself. Like to hear Ron MacLean talk about the whites, as if that's like some group of people. It's an outdated way of speaking, and to me, I just cringe when I see this kind of stuff being spoken about. More and more people are just going to tune out because no one wants to hear that kind of stuff. Okay, let's move away from politics for a second with this story that really just sort of tears at your heartstrings. So a 3-month-old baby in Ottawa was diagnosed with a brain tumor in November. She's currently having surgery to remove as much of the mass as possible. And obviously this is just, one of the horrible tragedies that could happen to a family having a child with this kind of illness. As sad as this is, the family has put together a fundraiser online, a GoFundMe. Their campaign goal was to raise $50,000 so that the family is not able to work at this point because the mom and dad are spending all of their time in the hospital at the bedside with their young daughter. So they had a goal of raising $50,000. They've already raised $59,000. So, this is just a beautiful example of how a community can come together to support someone in a time of need. There's nothing more tragic than a child that's sick and has cancer, but this is the value of community, of people just using the internet, using social media for good, to help this family in their time of need. So if you're able head on over. We'll include a link to the GoFundMe page and chip in a few dollars. And if not, just keep this family and this baby in your prayers, because I can't imagine what it's like to go through something like that. All right, going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back on Thursday from Toronto. So thank you so much and have a great day.